This show is a part of the FM Podcast Network, the home of great music podcasts. Visit us at fmpods.com.
We close the Boston sessions in this episode with executive editor of the Dylan Review, queer writer, educator, and friend Paul Haney. In this conversation, Paul generously shares the personal memoir he's writing and its connections to Dylan, and his thoughts on Dylan as a queer ally and on Dylan in general. It was an absolute pleasure to be in Boston and to be able to film 3 episodes with these friends and scholars. Stay tuned for next month when our tour heads on down the road to Chicago. Welcome to another episode of Infinity Goes Up on Trial. I'm Erin Callahan, your host, and I'm here with Paul Haney, my friend and colleague. He is the editor of the Dylan Review. He is an educator teaching at, among other places, Emerson, and also a writer of creative nonfiction. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. So we had a little bit of a scare. We almost didn't make it.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about
COVID. It's still out there,
It
huh?
is, 2 years later.
Well, I went to see Bruce Hornsby Thursday night at the Plymouth Memorial Hall, which is where Bob Dylan once launched the Rolling Thunder Review, which was really cool to see the auditorium there. And it was a great show. Bruce brought out the dulcimer, the accordion.
Cool. Yeah,
a lot of like roots, folky kind of music, but and the piano rock. We had piano rock and Plymouth rock.
All right.
So we had that
That's
covered.
Awesome.
But then the friend I went with just texted me before I came here to tell me that he tested positive for COVID, and I haven't had any symptoms or anything, but we had to delay the start for an hour so I could get a COVID test, which came up negative, thankfully.
It did.
So
yeah,
here we
we're
are.
grateful for that, and I'm so glad that you could be here. So one of the things that I wanted the show to focus on was how the ideas in Dylan influence us or affect us, or how Dylan has been influenced by other ideas. And I think the creative nonfiction that you're working on really speaks to that. So maybe I switched the questions around on you, but let's start with talking about your memoir, which you just talked about when we were in Denmark together.
Yeah, so I've been working on a memoir for several years now. The working title is No Secrets to Conceal, coming out with Bob Dylan. And it's a book project that has gone through many different iterations. It began while I was an MFA student in nonfiction at Emerson College, which is just down the road from where we are here over on the Common. And I was working on a book about the Amtrak. I had been traveling on the Amtrak for a summer back in 2012. I had a 45-day Amtrak rail pass, and I went all around the country.
That's great. Where did you go?
Well, I was living in Tallahassee, Florida at the time, and I actually started the trip in Boston, not knowing that I would ever move to Boston. But I went from Boston to New York City, Washington, D.C., up through Detroit and Ann Arbor, Chicago, went on the Empire Builder through Glacier National, which was stunningly beautiful.
I bet that's great.
Out to Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, back through Salt Lake City, Denver, Kansas City, St. Louis, down to Austin, and ended up in New Orleans.
Okay.
So that was like a 2-month journey, and I had...
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it was an amazing summer. I kept a blog of the whole thing. I had social media accounts. I did a crowdfunding campaign.
Can we find any of that?
And
link it in the show notes?
I have taken a lot of it down for the time being. So once I get this Bob Dylan book out there, I have hundreds and hundreds of manuscript pages of this Amtrak narrative that is my plan to get back to the train book once the Dylan book's out there. So I was working on that travel narrative during my MFA program. And I was just getting a lot of feedback from my classmates that, I don't know, that the narrator was sort of unlikable in my pages. That there were unkind depictions of women at times. And this is before I was out. I came to Boston at 30 years old, and I had, experimented with my sexuality, and I knew I was not entirely straight, but at the same time, like I had a girlfriend when I moved here. I was still kind of presenting as a straight guy who loved trains and beer and Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead, basically. Like that was my persona. Yeah, it's all embodied here. I just think I wasn't really hitting kind of the full stride of who I was and like my authentic personality. And I think that some of those hang-ups, like I was having to posture to be something that I really wasn't.
And that came through in your writing?
And it was coming through in my nonfiction writing, which is so tricky when you're writing from a first-person perspective. I mean, you get yourself down on the page for others to see and evaluate. Right. And at the same time, Emerson College is arguably the most progressive college.
Right.
At the time, I think one of the websites rated it as like the #1 most queer-friendly college in the country. And that's where I had landed to do my MFA as kind of a closeted queer person. Do
you think it was subconscious that you wound up there at the most queer, or one of the most queer-friendly colleges in the nation?
Potentially, yeah, potentially. Maybe to put myself in that environment, because I mean, I knew that, you know, I was going to have to come out one day, but I was still trying to kind of find the stores of courage to do that. I mean, I identify as bisexual, so
right,
and I'm a rather like straight presenting person, I think, and have heard through my time.
People are saying.
Yeah, people are saying.
People are saying. But I think sexuality is a spectrum, you know,
right.
And so where we land on the spectrum, I think it depends on, you know, our own personal identity and our experiences and who we are, you know, it just is. So, yeah, I mean, I think that, I think it tracks. I mean, whatever you decide to be, that's what I told my best friend, as long as you're still a decent human being, I don't care.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you're so true. I mean, sexuality as a spectrum, and also I think it's a fluid kind of spectrum too. I mean, we can have different sexualities at different times in our lives, at different moments of the day. We have various different attractions, sexual attractions. And I mean, I think when we're in our 20s and even into early 30s, like, I think sexuality is very much at the forefront of our thinking and how we're interacting with people and, you know, partnering up and, you know, how do we position ourselves in society. Whereas I think as we sort of mature, a lot of it is about, you know, finding a partner who's going to be a good match for you, or partners who are going to be a good match for you, good matches for you going forward. So yeah, I came to Emerson and I was sort of struggling with this stuff, and I had written hundreds and hundreds of pages of this train manuscript that my classmates were not jiving with.
You're not very supportive of.
Yeah, and in the meantime, my friend Alec, from when I was a kid back in Orlando, I grew up in Orlando, and my friend Alec, both of his parents were hippies, like real deal hippies, like they were at Woodstock.
Sweet.
They have a photo of themselves on top of a VW bus with like a line of their friends outside of the Woodstock Festival. And I would go to their last name is Schertz. I would go to the Schertz's house, and they just had racks and racks of records. And so they had all the Grateful Dead records, they had all the Bob Dylan records, Jefferson Airplane, Flying Burrito Brothers, all the stuff.
And how old were you when you were going through those records?
I mean, Alec was my friend since 5th, 6th grade. I would say by 7th grade, we were shuffling through these records and putting them on. And
so formative years.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was getting into the Beatles. I was getting a little into Bob Dylan, but then I got really into the Grateful Dead. And I think even as a kid, in my formative years, I knew I wasn't, you know, I had this queer dimension, and I didn't really feel safe showing that to people. So I kind of donned this deadhead persona from like 8th grade through high school. Were
you in a band, or were you friends with people in a band? Because I seem to remember this. Now it's like it's all kind of, it's coalescing in my brain of like Paul's early identity.
Was I in a band? Kind of, a couple
Okay.
times.
All right.
Nothing very serious.
Okay.
I do play a little keyboard, and I've been the melodica player in a
Okay.
band before. But I did have some friends in Boston. The band was called Spiritual Res, and they were like a reggae band, like a reggae jam band.
Now it's coming back.
Yeah, so eventually when I moved to Boston, like they were this friend base that was here already. And I think that was also part of the motivation for me to come to Emerson.
Yeah, that makes sense.
To like hang out with these people. But so while I was at Emerson, Alec sent me a message. And Alec was, a friend from growing up who I had explored all this music with. And he'd also put books in my hand from his parents also were like really well read, and like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, like a lot of the beat literature came on the road, came my way through the Schertz household. And Alec just sent me this message like, you need to explain to me why Tangled Up in Blue is regarded as such a great song. He even said the whole album Blood on the Tracks. He's like, I feel like it's one or two good songs, and the rest of it is just kind of like throwaway, like not very well formed. Hokum, I think was the word that he might have said.
Hokum, no.
Yeah, and so it just kind of ticked me off. I was like, what are you talking about? Like, this is a watershed moment in American music, and Americana musical art forms. They all blend together in this album. And so I asked him further, how did you come to this opinion? And he said he was working in a restaurant, and there was a dishwasher at the restaurant who wanted an introduction to Bob Dylan. So Alec put on Blood on the Tracks, and everyone in the restaurant was like, what is this? We don't really like it. And so I just had this thought like, well, maybe Blood on the Tracks is not the place to start. So I kind of launched this like Dylan hypothesis that like, if you really want to get into Bob Dylan, like maybe you should start at the very beginning.
Right.
And then go from there. I mean, since that time, yeah, that's one way to do it. There's like, a multitude of ways to get into Bob Dylan, surely. Right. But at that point, I started this blog where I listened to every Bob Dylan album in chronological order, up through Blood on the Tracks. I wrote an article for it for this magazine writing class. I was having a really good time. And I knew all the albums up through Blood on the Tracks, Desire, Street Legal I had when I was a kid, but then you hit the gospel years. And it's like, I actually didn't even really know the gospel years at that point. Slow Train and Saved, and then you get into the 80s. And
where we're going.
Where we're going soon, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And like, I had just skipped the 80s in my listening. I mean, I wasn't a devout Dylan scholar at that time. I was a heavy-duty fan, for sure. I mean, Time Out of Mind is the first album I can recall in my lifetime being released and critically heralded.
The new release, that's for me too. That I remember that as a big deal.
Yeah, Time Out of Mind. And then, Love and Theft. I just fell in love with Love and Theft when it came out. And then I was off and running with Dylan's late era.
Right.
And then the earlier years. And then there was this sort of gap in the middle. I had just skipped because I had heard, actually, the Schertz family had told me, like, you can just skip the gospel stuff. You can skip the 80s. Just go right to the late era. Like, there's nothing worth uncovering there. Right. So the rest of the summer I spent continuing to go album by album. I still feel like 80s Dylan is somewhat of a learned taste, but I learned it eventually. Now I love, now I listen to Empire Burlesque as much as anything else.
I love Empire Burlesque.
It's terrific, right? In the gospel era.
I say that to like, hey, like, I love that album.
Well, so do I. So do I. And I listen to as much gospel era now as I do anything else. But by the end of the summer, when I completed the project, I think Shadows in the Night, Triplicate hadn't come out yet.
Right.
I think it was Shadows in the Night.
Was that 2016?
2016, and then he won the Nobel Prize. He was awarded the Nobel Prize, like right when I posted my last post, and I was like, oh, this is like serendipity or something.
Right.
And by that time I was getting some attention as like the guy who's doing that Bob Dylan blog, at least from people around Emerson College.
Right.
And then the Nobel just kind of like boosted that a little bit. So I was struggling so much with my train book that I said, you know what, maybe I have a Bob Dylan book on my hands. And I was going into my third and final year of the MFA. And so I talked to my thesis advisor and I was like, yeah, I think I just want to do a Bob Dylan book instead. So I started writing the Bob Dylan book. And I had expanded on each of the albums as its own separate chapter. And that's what I had been writing for my thesis and then beyond for a couple years. I ended up meeting all the Bob Dylan people I could meet in Boston. I went to see Christopher Ricks a couple times and chatted with him, which was a real treat.
He's lovely.
Yeah, he has this reputation of being grouchy.
Someone said that to me too, and I said I found him to be lovely. And then when I went to a conference in Arras, France, and Christopher Ricks just loved David, my partner David, and it was a very small conference, very much like the one in Denmark, and we had dinner together, we were together quite often, and he did a presentation on Tempest that he didn't think went over well, and the elevator was super small in the hotel we were in. And he got on with David, and I couldn't fit in the elevator, and he said to David, something akin to, I've made a terrible mistake. Like, I've had a bad day at work today. And he was just so warm and affable. I don't know how he got that reputation.
Well, I went to his office and I talked to him about my hypothesis.
Okay.
And
Sorry to derail you.
No, I have context for that too, I think. He gave me some information. He sort of evaluated my Bob Dylan hypothesis. By this time I had also reached out to Al Cooper and asked him what he thought. And he told me that he was not the person that I wanted to roll around with on these subjects, and that any kind of biographical reading was conjecture and folly, which could be true. I mean, I think he has a point. But I wasn't necessarily doing strict biographical reading. I had this idea that each subsequent album is building on the one that came before, and that the things that are happening in Dylan's life are influencing what's coming out on the albums, which is absolutely true. I mean, if you look at New Morning, if you look at the Basement Tapes.
Well, it's my argument that he says in False Prophet what he can't say in The Wicked Messenger, because he has those lines that are similar about opening your heart. And I'm like, well, 80-year-old Bob Dylan can say that, but the reason the False Prophet doesn't utter any words is because he's not quite ready at 26 to say that yet. And so it does depend on where he is in his life and his career. So I think that's a valid argument. Yeah.
And Christopher Ricks told me, he said, you're in danger of being too gigantic. He's like, you can't, he's like, he said you have to have a handle. Because his book was The 7 Deadly Sins, Visions of Sin.
Yeah, Visions of Sin.
And so his handle were the 7 deadly sins.
Right.
And that was his way into the material. So he told me, like, you can't just take on everything. You have to have an angle.
Right. That's great advice.
It was good advice. Yeah. And he recommended to me that I'd make as my angle Dylan's mortality. How Dylan is aging with each album, and sort of like what you were just saying.
Right.
80-year-old Dylan can say things that 26-year-old Dylan wouldn't have said.
Right.
Or couldn't
or wouldn't
have said.
Wouldn't have thought to say.
Yeah. But I kind of left that meeting thinking, I'm not that interested in mortality yet.
Right. What year was that?
Maybe I am now. But
maybe Dylan wasn't that interested in it.
Yeah. This would have been 2017.
Okay, well, it
early
wasn't dark
2017.
Yet.
Yeah.
He's getting there. So you left thinking you're not interested in mortality, so...
I thought, I'm a creative nonfiction writer. I write essays, memoir. I was like, my handle is myself.
Right.
I need to get myself into this book.
Okay.
My own experiences, my experiences with the Schertzes, my experience with Time Out of Mind and Love and Theft growing up with these albums. My experiences being, I wasn't really ready to go there even then, but being a closeted queer teenager who took on a deadhead persona so I could have something to kind of present myself with to the world.
And do you think that you did that to connect with other people as well, that you had a common interest with folks, and so you could, there was something there? And obviously you still love the music because you're wearing the hat, and so it was something genuine that you were interested in, and you could connect with people.
Absolutely. There was such just a loving, supportive community of deadheads. It was also time when AOL chat rooms were in vogue. And I had
the 90s.
Late night. My handle was Deadbear13.
I love that.
Maybe some old 710 Ashbury patrons recognize because I was there every day. There was a line to get in on the AOL chat room every day.
Oh, remember when you had to wait to get in?
To wait, and then there was a secondary room. I think it was called the Rose Garden. I mean, that was really formative stuff. And I'd get on there and just chat with deadheads. And then
that's cool.
Before long, they started asking for my mailing address, not for anything nefarious, but because they wanted to send me cassette bootlegs.
That's awesome.
And my mom didn't want me giving our address out over the internet, rightfully. So the Shirtses said, okay, give them our address. And so these deadheads from AOL were mailing cassette bootlegs to the Shirts house.
What wonderful, supportive people they were.
It was terrific. I learned so much from them. And they would check out the cassettes and they would make their own copies and then pass them along to me. Or sometimes it would be like a fish show or like string cheese incident or something, and they'd be like, we're not going to copy this one. We bonded over Little Feet.
Okay.
Tina Shirts and I had a big affinity for Little Feet in the day, in those days. But the Deadhead community was something that I still gravitate toward, and I think through the Grateful Dead is how I got into Bob Dylan. Because I saw the Grateful Dead were playing tons of Bob Dylan songs. There's that great Jerry Garcia Band Double Live album, which is like half Bob Dylan songs.
You would get along with my friend Carrie. He was a huge Deadhead and a huge Dylan fan too.
Right. Or I mean, Court and I had a lot of these conversations in Denmark for sure.
So then how did it go? How did your memoir then shift to what it is now?
Well, eventually I just kept, the more I dug into Dylan, I got through all the albums. I wrote my chapters. I just kept getting feedback like, you got to go deeper. What's the deeper dimension here? I mean, because when you're writing memoir, it's a different, you have a different task than when you write a critical article. I mean, critical analysis can be a little bit, in third person, you can be a little bit detached and removed from it. But when you're writing creative nonfiction, I mean, you just have to pour your heart onto the page, and you're going to put things out there that you don't even realize are in yourself, that the reader's going to see and mirror back to you that's there. And I just had this feeling like this isn't going to work until like I just come out with my sexuality already. In the meantime, I'm looking at Bob Dylan. He starts out as a folk singer in Greenwich Village and decides he wants to become a rock and roll star. So he just does it.
Right.
He pisses everybody off, but he plugs in and goes electric anyway. And then he's on this world tour, but he has this motorcycle crash and he's like, well, I'm done touring. Even though, Albert Grossman would have loved for him to get back on the world tour. He goes through the 70s, he fashions himself more of like a singer-songwriter type, but then by the late 70s, early 80s, he's into gospel, and that pisses everybody off again. And there are just these moments in his career where he just is so unconcerned with what people think about what he's doing. And I just started to kind of like draw strength from that, like his courage to put himself out there as a creative person. The sacrifices he makes for his art and his artistic vision without regard to how it's going to play with the critics, with the audience. He just has a vision and he pursues it. And I felt like I was not doing that. I felt like I was sort of cowering to societal expectations and sort of not expressing fully who I was.
So Dylan just kind of going through and being, I hate to use this word with him because it's so charged, but not maybe not being authentic, that's the word, but doing what he thinks is the right thing, taking him in the right direction for his art and for whatever identity performance he feels as he goes forward, and as we change and evolve, as we grow, that made you feel more comfortable.
Yeah, it made me feel more comfortable, and also
in terms of what you're doing with your own writing.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And I started to feel like, well, if I'm going to succeed as an artist, as someone who has an MFA in creative writing, like I'm not going to be able to do that as like a closeted queer beer guzzling Grateful Dead head. Like it's not working. Well, it wasn't working, you know? And in the meantime, I mean, neither were my relationships.
Right.
Neither were, and I would, you know, I spent a lot of time, it's hard for me to get back into the headspace of what I was in at the time, but just a lot of daily fretting about how am I going to do this? How am I going to say these words? How am I going to tell these people? And it was through writing that I started exploring, and then eventually I was like, well, once I get some of this stuff published, like people are going to know.
Right. That's interesting. I just had a question and it went, no, this is what it was. I was going to ask you, so you don't think that you can create maybe good or honest art if you're not honest with who you are?
It depends on the art, and it depends on who you are.
Tell me more. You're like, all right.
Talk about like, you know, a fluid spectrum of creativity. I think that...
Or is it a process of figuring out who you are through the creation of your art?
Yeah, I like that too.
I mean, honestly, none of us really knows. I mean, we're figuring out as we go, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think we have a lot of sort of impulses and kind of subconscious things that we do that we're not even aware of that makes up a person, and like how much control do we even really have over that? I think, you know, if you're looking at songwriting and poetry, there's a persona behind the work. There's a speaker, and that speaker is a construct, of course, and a person, a writer can create that construct that is separate from themselves, and I think you can create amazing work even if you're ignorant of some things inside of yourself, or you don't want to share those things about yourself. Sure, I mean, I think it's absolutely possible. With fiction, I mean, of course you can.
But you're saying with memoir, the task is different.
That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, you have to be, maybe I won't say have to, but you might want to be honest with yourself to then put that in the work.
Yeah, I think with memoir, you're always saying more than you think you are and less than you think you are.
Right. So what about chronicles then?
Well,
as memoir.
Chronicles is a strange
I'm sorry, I
beast.
literally just thought of that. I'm like, well, then, I mean, he defies all of our expectations, I guess.
I think, you know, I mentioned in Denmark, at the conference in Denmark, that chronicles can be seen as a work of creative nonfiction. It absolutely fits. And so can philosophy of modern song. It's kind of like musical lyric essays. Dylan does these strange things, though, where he's, you know, when you go to memoir, it's this most personal outpouring of your life, and he's using other people's words in order to, you know, paint the most intimate picture of his experiences, which is such a curious thing to do. Like, who knows why he does that? Maybe, you know, sometimes I think that's just the way his brain works. You know, that doesn't mean it's inauthentic. That he's using, you know, who does he use? Hemingway's texts, the like 40 Keys of Power by
You just go to Scott Wormuth and see everything exactly. He's called.
Well, Scott Wormuth has that Bob Dylan's bookshelf with all these titles on it.
So you were saying Scott Wormuth has Bob Dylan's bookshelf.
Well, yeah, and just how curious it is how Bob Dylan weaves in writing from, of course, from Jack London, Ernest Hemingway, into this most intimate genre of writing, which is, memoir, telling your personal story. I suppose maybe he fudges that a bit by calling it a chronicle.
Right.
The first of who knows how many chronicles, or perhaps the only.
Maybe. I wonder too if it's like what Phil Hale said in his interview with Jim Salvucci and the Dylantantes, that Dylan is sort of recognizing his place in Western culture, and so by weaving all of that together, he's weaving his personal story in with, the greater Western literary tradition.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know, I just thought of that on the fly. It sounds
absolutely.
Good.
Well, I think it's, his writings from 97 on, 96 on are also kind of a storehouse of what he's been reading.
Right.
Because he reads things, apparently he writes them down, scraps of paper, and then he goes to write and he sifts through his scraps and they end up in his, not only what he's been reading, but what he's been listening to, what he's been watching. And so, it's his magpie personality where he grabs all these things. So if he has been reading like the history, the Western canon of literature, which it seems like he does.
Right.
I mean, apparently he told Christopher Ricks he'd been reading Hamlet or Macbeth on.
I was going to say it was one of the Shakespeare plays, the tragedies too, right?
Yeah, one of the tragedies. That's his leisure time reading sometimes, I suppose.
That's really cool. So then, how does your work kind of fit into this? I wrote in the questions that this conversation on Dylan and queerness, because your memoir obviously is your coming out story, and how does that fit into the larger conversation that is just kind of starting, or not really starting, but starting to take, to get a little bit more prominence now in Dylan studies?
Yeah, I don't make a claim that Bob Dylan is a queer artist.
Right.
I don't, that's something that is a personal matter for him. If he has a queer aspect of his personality, that's up for him to tell us about.
And that was something too that I said in the first note. It was like, I have no interest in talking about, the rumored dalliance that he had with Marlon Brando or Allen Ginsberg. Like, I don't care about that. What I'm more interested in is what you, as a person who was thinking about coming out, what you saw in Dylan that made you recognize something that you were like, oh, I could do this. Like there are the articles, not do this, but like you recognize something in Dylan's, like you said, his courage, or in the lyrics where it made you feel more comfortable or come to some sort of, I don't want to say reckoning, that's the worst word to say, but it's like, some sort of, what is the word I'm looking for? Just that you felt comfortable sharing who you were with other folks. And there are those, the two articles that I mentioned, Andrew Warwick's Bob Dylan, a Queer Icon, ? And then Kaiser's The Unlikely Life-Saving Queerness of Bob Dylan. And it has a subtitle, The Bard of the 60s Wasn't Gay, but His Art Made a Huge Difference to Those of Us Who Were. And it's that subtitle to me that I think is really the most important part, because he's not claiming Dylan is gay or saying anything about his sexuality, but he pulls out these things that, like the Verlaine and Rimbaud reference, and You're Gonna Make Me Lonesome When You Go, that he's not comparing his relationship to a gay relationship, he's comparing his relationship to a relationship that's troubled. And he's not seeing any sexuality in it, but in some ways, Kaiser says that normalizes it. And just makes it as something that is rather than something that's othered. And I found that particularly interesting.
Yeah.
So I wonder what you thought about all of that. And then there's, you brought up Ludo Foster's work, which I had forgotten about, and Ludo was generous enough to send me his article, and Patrick Webster's work as well. And so there are people out there talking, as part of this conversation.
Folks,
and you're coming at it in a very similar way that's personal to you, which I agree with you, that's the important part, is how is Dylan's art affecting folks?
Yeah, and I've published an essay in the Rumpus, He's Funny That Way, which I'm going to add to that collection of articles that are out there. Because as I was dating my, the person who later became my husband, Bob Dylan released that song, He's Funny That Way, which to me was like a revelation. I think I had just come back from the archive. I had made it all the way to the Tulsa archive.
If I remember that story from Denmark, I think that's what you said.
Yeah, and I, I was like, in the archive during the day, looking at the Mississippi manuscript pages, and then at night I was like on Grindr and Tinder, like hooking up with men in my Airbnb room, and I still hadn't sort of put these two things together. But now in hindsight, part of my work, the work that I've been doing, is looking at the revisions that Bob Dylan is going through, even in those Mississippi pages, and thinking about how I was revising my own approach to my life. And so I think there certainly are many examples of queerness that exist in Dylan's catalog. I think those aren't necessarily the moments that I always drew strength from. I mean, a lot, we can count a lot of these queer references as like references to drag.
Which Ludo focuses on in his paper.
Yeah, which is fascinating, thinking of drag as a kind of just another mask someone could wear, and maybe even a stand-in for kind of like blackface minstrelsy, which Dylan has always had a fascination with, but maybe isn't as palatable to use in his work. But then thinking about Greenwich Village in the early 60s, I mean, he would have been, in and around burlesque shows, drag shows. I don't know if there were like bathhouses around there. When I look at the lyrics of like Ballad of a Thin Man, the opening stanza, you walk in the room with a pencil in your hand, you see somebody naked, you say, who is that man? One way to read that is like, sounds like a guy walking into a bathhouse. And looking to hook up with somebody, what are you going to say when you get home? Who's he going? Is he going home to his heterosexual family?
So sort of a double life.
The double life.
And then you did the sort of tongue-in-cheek analysis in Denmark.
Yeah, and then if you keep looking at Ballad of a Thin Man, though, I don't really see the queer reading bearing out in every verse. I think it's a bit of a weak reading. I think the stronger reading is that of a journalist or that of someone from the media trying to capture what is this counterculture, what is this bazaar of images that I'm looking at here that Dylan Speaker says that person is just not going to understand these grotesqueries. Right.
And I wonder too, I agree with that reading. And it kind of goes with that quote that I love from Chronicles. And maybe I love it because I've always thought this, that I always thought of mainstream culture as lame as hell and a big trick. And in that, I'm not sure if it was you or Grayley who said there's this sort of heteronormative, regular middle class guy who's walking into, he's the outsider in that community of freaks where he's being othered. And so that in that way, I wonder if you think that Dylan, kind of, I hate the word, but normalizing or people who feel like they're marginalized, that they're part of the in-group, and making sort of that person who is in the in-group feel as an outsider as part of the reason why people like me who have felt, on the outside a lot, like feel comfortable with Dylan.
I think it's an interesting question. I mean,
like, I'm a stranger here and no one sees me is one of my favorite lines,
Yeah. I think the mainstream culture, can mainstream culture ever be the outsider? Can the normative personality, the normative identity, be made to feel marginalized? I mean, what is that dynamic? The marginalized culture is marginalized because they are separate from the mainstream. Right. And so there's automatically a power imbalance there, right? That the marginalized identity, you know, what tools do they have to bring someone from the mainstream down to their level?
It's the power structure that you're talking about, that they are part of the power structure. But I think he's trying hard in that. You know, you don't identify with Mr. Jones and the people in that. I mean, when you listen to it, you're like, yeah, I know it. I get Mr. Jones.
When I asked Al Cooper if he wanted to talk to me, and he said, you know, I think your idea is conjecture and folly, I felt a little bit like Mr. Jones.
Did you really?
Well, because I've done journalism before, you know, as someone who, I think we as Dylan critics sometimes should look at ourselves and be like, okay, am I taking, and then so to go back to like, am I taking this too far? I think there's a danger of, if we try to queer everything in Dylan's studies, not that anyone's trying to do this, but if we put on the queer lens, like the critical lens of queer reading, you know, and I talked about in Denmark, like, how far can you take it? Like blowing in the wind? Can you say that that's about a blowjob? Of course not. I mean, that's just too far. And not only is that too far, but it's like, it's defiling this sort of like sacred text that we have blowing in the wind. And like the man in me, you know, it's hilarious to think about, oh, that could be Bob Dylan thinking about gay sex. But if you look at the lyrics, I mean, there's a heteronormativity to most of Dylan's songs.
But I think too, the point, I agree with you 100%. We can press the text and we can find things that aren't there, and we could try too hard to draw things out. And I let your examples, the man in me and blowing in the wind, really do prove the point. But I think when you see things like, you know, maybe you can read like in Chimes of Freedom, where you're talking about, you know, let me look at my notes because I have them written down.
Every hung up person in the whole wide
No,
universe.
not those people. Lonesome hearted lovers with too personal a tale, and for each unharmful gentle soul misplaced inside a jail. You know, that can be read as, you know, raids on you know, the bathhouses and stuff like that. And so it's not that that's the only reading, but you could see someone who is looking at that and saying like, I'm that person. And that's what I'm interested in. The people who have that personal connection and see some sort of representation in Dylan, that it's, you know, there's a sense of, I would say, generosity and understanding in some of the stuff that he's putting out there.
Absolutely, yeah, that's absolutely in there, and that goes back to the Verlaine and Rimbaud reference, the fact that he's not looking at, you know, heterosexual, homosexual relationships, but just a relationship is a relationship, and that in itself can be a radical idea, and the fact that when he wrote that, you know, that came out of him, that the speaker of this song's relationship is like this other relationship between two men.
And that's what I'm kind of getting at, is that Dylan is looking at it. I mean, it's hard enough to have a relationship with yourself, and you've proven that just with, you know, your conversation about just coming out. And I think all of us feel that in some sort of way, whether, you know, what part of the spectrum we're on or what our background is, and you know, so I think that, or where we're coming from, but having a relationship with another person, regardless of the gender, is so challenging and difficult. And I think that's what Dylan's pointing out in that, maybe. And it goes back to that that Shelton quote from March that I wrote to you. It's kind of long, but he says, love and sex are things that really hang everybody up. I truthfully can tell you that male and female are not here to have sex. You know, that's not the purpose. I don't believe that that's God's will. And maybe he changed that, you know, when he got to the gospel phase, who knows. And there is, you're right, a lot of heteronormative stuff, but he says sex and love have nothing to do with female and male. It's just whatever two souls happen to be. It could be male and female, and it might not be male and female. It might be female and female, and it might be male and male. And so he's saying, you know, and to Shelton in an interview, and maybe it's a put on, but maybe in that particular interview, I think it happens on a plane where he's so tired that he's just kind of rambling, as Shelton says. And so maybe there's a sense of honesty there that we don't always attribute to his interviews, especially in '66.
Sure.
So I think that's what I see there, that for him it's not, he's not trying to make a grand statement. It's just, it just is for him.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was something going on in the culture that he was a part of, in the circles that he was in the early and mid 60s, right. Where maybe, people were experimenting, and that there was more openness with this. I mean, we're talking about New York City. We're talking about Manhattan, Lower Manhattan.
Greenwich Village.
Village. I mean, these are his friends. These are the people he's circulating with.
Right.
And I think that he seemed to have adopted those points of view that, like, it's not a big deal.
Right.
Soon after that, he becomes more of a family man, which is, your presentation in Denmark went into that quite thoroughly. In the gospel era, he, said some troubling things.
Correct.
What did he say in the gospel? And he said, they started the tour in San Francisco, and it turns out like 3/4 of the population is gay.
Right.
And, the activity's not going on in somebody's closet. I guess they have a political party they're organizing, and he bemoaned this. And I mean, a lot of his sermons from that time, he was sort of predicting the end times. Like, these are harbingers that the Bible has foretold that, the end is near. And that homosexuality was
part of that.
Yeah, one of the signs that it was coming. But then soon after that, he said, Kurt Loder asked him about Allen Ginsberg. I think it was 83 or 84, and Dylan said, I don't have any problem with what anybody does.
Right.
Like, it's not my place to judge. And so it was a very
84. I think it's at 84.
Yeah. So it was a very brief moment in time where he was spouting homophobia.
Right.
But it was blatant homophobia.
Absolutely.
And again, I think what he says from the stage isn't necessarily like what Bob Dylan always believes, but it's part of this like grander act of Bob Dylan, the performing artist, Bob Dylan, the performer,
right,
has all these different permutations. For the most part, he seems to be wholly accepting. And then even with, he's funny that way, from what I've read, the coverage of that song, that he was excited to do it. He had an idea right away.
Right.
He flipped the pronouns of the song "She's Funny That Way" to be "He's Funny That Way," and he did it for an album that was made for same-sex marriages. And then my husband and I had our first dance to that song, which was, I kind of knew while the dance was going, like, oh, this is so going in the book. Like, this is a scene from the book.
Right.
And I was so happy we got to do it. And then it became this, like, this great kind of end point for the manuscript, and sort of like put a frame on things for me.
So you said that Dylan doesn't necessarily influence your writing, so what writers do?
Did I say that? I think Dylan has a huge influence on my writing.
You did say that.
What I was saying was, when in my coming out journey through Bob Dylan, it's not necessarily these moments of queerness that I gravitate to. It's things like "He who is not being born is busy dying." It's things like, all the truth in the world adds up to one big lie. There's just various points in his catalog, just these truths that I gravitate toward.
Earlier, when you were talking about you were writing and it was pouring out of you, and I heard every one of those words rang true and glued like burning coals.
I've always loved that.
Me
because
too.
He's writing about poetry in his song, and it's like, what poet is this? And then
so then what Bob Dylan does, other than those lines, like how does he influence you, and then what other writers influence you?
Yeah, I think Bob Dylan's writing has always been incredibly liberating for me. And when I was in high school, I would listen to, another side of Bob Dylan when I was in high school gave me all these ideas of how to write about romantic struggles, frustrations, which everyone has them in high school.
Yeah.
Just in a way where it's like, okay, you don't have to like stick to the form, and you don't have to just like write in these kind of rosy cliches, but you can actually really get like deep into yourself.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that comes from, you mentioned in your pre-interview document like Rimbaud, derangement of the senses.
Right.
I've always really gravitated toward that kind of thing. Other writers, I read a lot of Maggie Nelson during my MFA. I was influenced by the Beats a lot, and I think a lot of that beat affect is part of what led to some troubling results in my train manuscript, because I'm writing my beat narrative, but from the train, and it's like, well, if you go back, because I teach beat literature now, and then when I teach on the road, it's like we always have the discussion of, to use the same phrase, problematic treatment of women that show up in On the Road.
Right.
But at the same time, there's the kind of like propulsive energy that I think still infects American literature.
I remember the first time I read Howl, and I was just it definitely changed my life. And I always say, like, well, that just bent my brain a little bit.
Yeah.
And that was one of the pieces. And then I wanted to read everything Ginsberg had written. And then he's from New Jersey, and I'm a homer. So, anyone who's from New Jersey, I must, invest in. But there are others, Whitman, also the Jersey connection. But, later in life. And so there are these poets that we know were, outwardly queer that Dylan is using. And then he writes in Key West, I was born on the wrong side of the tracks like Ginsberg, Corso, and Kerouac. Is he saying that he's an outsider? I don't think, it's not his queer statement, but is he saying, what do you, like,
Ginsberg,
does it fit the rhyme? Is that it? Is it that simple?
Yeah, I was listening to that earlier today.
Yeah.
Because I was listening to that playlist that one of the writers put together. And it's a curious mix of songs.
Warwick,
some of them I'm like, where is the queer connection?
I thought the same
here?
thing too. And I'm gonna put the playlist, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Yeah.
I would like to hear him sort of
articulate
for each song. But I think in that one, I was born on the wrong side of the tracks is kind of I think Bob Dylan often resorts to railroad imagery, which is part of his like beat nature, and he's writing about the beats here, like Ginsberg, Corso, and Kerouac, which is kind of, if you were going to have a Mount Rushmore of beats, put those three on there. And, maybe Neil Cassidy to get your fourth one, to round it off. And that song, down in the bottom, down at the bottom, down in Key West, it's like the bottom of the U.S. I think it seems like he's thinking about traveling, wherever I travel, wherever I roam, I'm not too far from the convent home. Is it combat zone?
But there's always like there's such an interesting experience being in Key West. We're from Florida, and
Spiritual Rez and I have had some wild times in Key West.
Okay, we David and I have had some wild times in Key West.
I don't really know what he's doing with those three in Key West.
And
except
it's such a beautiful song too.
Yeah. I like the Ginsberg to Whitman connection though, because Howl was very much influenced by Leaves of Grass and Song of Myself. Yeah. And later on we get, from the same album, Rough and Rowdy Ways, we get Bob Dylan's I Contain Multitudes.
Where he says, I rollick and frolic with all the young dudes.
Yeah, he says a lot of gay stuff in that song. Actually, this is what I brought.
You brought lyrics. I love that.
That is the song that I've been looking at. And I said in Denmark that it's kind of an ode to like bi and pansexuality. Right. Because he's playing with these dualisms. There's feminine energy and imagery and masculine, and he's got them all up next to each other. I fuss with my hair, and I fight blood feuds. I paint landscapes and I paint nudes. I rollick and I frolic with all the young dudes, which to me sounds like, this is something I looked up before I came here, chapter 11 from Song of Myself.
Okay.
28 young men bathed by the shore. 28 young men and also friendly. 28 years of womanly life and also lonely. And so there's this woman who's looking out at these men bathing in the shore. Dancing and laughing along the beach came the 29th bather, who's the woman. The rest did not see her, but she saw them and loved them. And so when he says, I rollick and I frolic with all the young dudes, it takes me back to the Whitman poem. In this chapter that, when we learn that poem, Song of Myself, in grade school or even college, we didn't think of it as like, oh, Walt Whitman was like a gay man who was writing about multitudes. We thought of it as, well, he was creating a new poetic art form for America, and he was also a nurse in the Civil War. Isn't that interesting? Like, the detail of his sexuality and his queerness doesn't come into it. But I feel like Dylan's going back and is kind of reclaiming some of that for Walt Whitman in the song I Contain Multitudes. Right. And then this really fascinating thing that Dylan does.
I love to see you so excited right now. This is great.
I love this turn that he does. Pink pedal pushers, red blue jeans, another one of those dualisms. Yeah. All the pretty maids and all the old queens. Are we? Yeah, that's what we're doing.
Yep. Subconsciously too.
Right. Yeah, we pulled it off. All the old queens from all my past lives. So one has to wonder, who are these old queens? Is it Allen Ginsberg?
It has to be. But also the queens that he's written about, like Queen Jane. Yeah.
Well, he says queens twice. Right. All the old queens, all the old queens. Right. So it's like there's two different kinds of queens, perhaps.
It could be.
Paul Clayton is another person we haven't mentioned. But like a very close friend of Bob Dylan's from the folk years. And apparently in that that car trip they took around the U.S. South, was it 1964?
Yes.
I think it was early 64. He and Paul Clayton
because
sat
it was when the Beatles came out. Yeah.
Right.
So it's got to be early, like February, March.
David Haydu did a great presentation on this at Dylan and the Beats.
Were you at Dylan and the Beats?
No, but I watched it. Okay. Because I wrote an article on...
I don't remember you being at Dylan and the Beats because we were there.
Yeah, no, I didn't go, but I eventually wrote an article on teaching Dylan and the Beats for the Teaching Bob Dylan.
I will tell you that's how I remembered it was David Haydu's presentation.
Yeah.
When you just said, I'm like, oh, it was, because I was thinking about his presentation.
Yeah. Oh, for the Paul Clayton material is fascinating.
Yeah.
And he had gone to the archive in, it's here in Massachusetts, actually, down on the southern coast.
Okay.
Like Fall River, I think. I want to get down there and see and poke around a little bit. But Paul Clayton was a gay man who was recording all these folk songs, and he had a huge crush on Bob Dylan, apparently. Right. Just like Allen Ginsberg apparently had a huge crush on Bob Dylan. And it seems like Dylan kind of played off of these people. Like maybe didn't all out reject them. I'm not saying he gave into their advances, but maybe he enjoyed the attention. But the two of them apparently sat in the back seat of this car for like the whole car ride around the South. So anyway, maybe he's one of the old queens that Dylan's thinking about here as well. But then as he's talking about the old queens, he makes this turn. I carry 4 pistols and 2 large knives. Right. I'm a man of contradictions. I'm a man of many moods. I contain multitudes. And then it's that hostility I carry for, like, it's a warning. And
it's also, but it's a violent image, like a warning that I'm armed.
Exactly. Like I have contradictions. I have multitudes. I have queens in my past, but don't mess with me because I also have guns and knives.
Right.
And
don't press me on it because I'll only tell you what I want to tell you. And so
And then that hostility, it's like he puts up a wall.
And it also kind of makes me think of his sharp wit too, how acerbic he could be when he was going after someone. Like that's a knife. He could cut you with words.
Right. Yeah. You greedy old wolf, I'll show you my heart, but not all of it, only the hateful part.
Right. See, and that again is the sharp wit. I'll show you the hateful part.
The hateful part.
Right.
Yeah.
I love that, the way he sings it too, the phrasing on that line.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that's a really great argument that he's reclaiming some of the queerness for Whitman, where we tend to gloss over that maybe, or did in the Academy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's wonderful.
And again, through the persona of that song, like he's tapping into Whitman.
Yeah, and that duality is just, I love that you point that out. Laura Tencher and I recently discussed Dylan's masculinity. We agree he's comfortable with his identity and his performance of it. We talked about how there are pictures of women cradling him, or him sitting on women's laps, or Joan Baez lifting him up. So he's in that. He's comfortable with being vulnerable, I guess, or perceived as vulnerable, and to allow for heteronormative or challenges to it. And so, what do you think about Dylan's performance in concert, like Rolling Thunder or interviews? And I think of the one where we see Martha Quinn putting makeup on him, which I love that interview, that video.
I'm not
you
sure.
You don't know it?
No.
Oh, it's so great. I'll send you a link. She's literally putting eyeliner and mascara on him.
Is it for Hearts of Fire?
I can't. It's 85, 86, so it's got to be. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And it's behind. It's backstage, so he's backstage in for a concert.
Okay.
But yeah. And she's just putting makeup on him.
Yeah. His mascara era is great. I've got my dangling earring
I know.
here as an homage to 80s Dylan.
It has become a recent joke and part of the conversation that I love 80s leather Dylan. So
yeah. And he's gone through so many iterations of masculinity. There's so many versions of Dylan's masculinity. You look at the younger Dylan, he's this like cherubic folk babe. It's
right. But he also, I think it was both Susie Rotolo and Joan Baez said, like, you just wanted to mother him. Like, he just needed mothering.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And but then you see those photos of him like by the pool, and he's skinny as a rail.
Yeah.
And I think there's one where he's like crouching, like almost like he doesn't want to be photographed.
Right. Which is odd how that big fat baby in the picture with the three women, his mother, his grandmother, and the polka dot. Have you seen that? He's just this like huge face. How that kid grew into that.
Oh yeah, it's just rail thin. Yeah. What does he have to be ashamed about? I guess he's also one of the most famous people in the world by that time.
Exactly.
He can do no wrong.
Right. He's definitely. And Rolling Thunder, where he's got like the feather, and we have also Joan Baez is in drag, mimicking him, and there's just like a lot of really.
Sean Lathan called that his cowboy drag.
Yeah.
Which was an interesting phrase, and I think Dylan uses the phrase drag in several of his songs, and you can think of his different costumes.
Temporary like Achilles.
Hungry like a man in drag. I always thought he was saying hungry like a man eating dragon. I don't know if anyone else had that mishearing, which I think makes a little more sense than a man. Hungry like a man in drag.
Yeah, I'll have to puzzle that one out.
I think when men are in drag, they don't eat that very much until they get out of drag.
I'm going to tell you, women's clothes are confining, so
right, exactly. I've been hanging out with some drag queens in Salem lately, and they're in drag, they perform, and then they get out of drag as quickly as possible.
Exactly. So they're elastic waistbands.
Yeah.
But I think that's an interesting comment that he said. But isn't that like going to dress in drag? Isn't that a reference to Some Like It Hot in?
Do the jitterbug rag.
Ain't no shortcuts. Gonna dress in drag.
Gonna get as far away from myself as I can. But
which wearing drag is getting away from your previous identity. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also in that song. It's such a jivey song. It's so lively.
Yeah.
And it's like he's gonna. It's just another version of letting loose.
Right.
Dress in drag. It's like a laugh.
Right.
But then the next verse he says, I'm gonna fall in love with the next woman I meet, put her in a wheelbarrow
and wheel her down the street.
Wheel her down the street. So he's back, which is funny.
Yeah.
But it's back to this heteronormativity.
Right.
Like he's probably not going to be in drag when he falls in love with a woman and pushes her down the street.
Maybe.
Yeah. It's all cobbled together.
Yeah.
So.
He could.
I love the crossing the Rubicon. Just those lyrics. I think it was just one night he inserted those lyrics.
Right.
Which I also have.
All right. Pulling out the receipts.
If I can get these correct. You foxy man, you're the talk of the town. You've been sucking off all the younger men.
Yes.
Wow. Holy crap.
Right. Yeah.
Let me read that again.
Yeah.
You foxy man, you're the talk of the town. You've been sucking off all the younger men.
Yeah.
So this is an older man.
Right.
At least older than the younger men. Who's now the talk of the town for sucking off all the younger men.
Right.
All the younger men. I mean, and that's a really fascinating thing for, 80-year-old Bob Dylan to weave into his lyrics.
Well, he used to care.
Yeah, right.
It is interesting that, why in that performance and that, why isn't it on the album, but maybe, the mood just struck him that was the night to sing that. It's interesting.
It was still a work in progress.
Visions and revisions, as I always say.
Yeah.
So when is your memoir going to be finished, and when are your visions and revisions going to be finished? Because I know everyone now wants to read it.
Yeah.
I do.
Well, thank you for asking. It's, I have two different writing groups. They're both reading chapter by chapter. I have one more chapter to share with them. And
potentially a coda.
Well, that includes the coda. It includes the complication of the marriage plot. And I mean, my plan is, I have it out at a couple memoir contests right now.
Right.
But the plan is that in the coming weeks, I'm gonna have it ready to start sending out to publishers again.
Good.
I had a publisher a couple years ago, but it all fell through in the final step of the process. But now I'm kind of happy that happened because the book came back into my hands and I had peer review letters, which were very complimentary, but they also had a couple critical angles that I could address. And so I've been expanding the book. It was funny, they wanted both more Bob Dylan and less Bob Dylan. And I think they were right. on both counts. So I've been putting more Bob Dylan in and taking some Bob Dylan out and just sort of trying to strike that right balance.
Right.
And I'm glad that I've had the additional chance to do that. And I don't know when this podcast is going to air, but with any luck, maybe I'll have a publishing contract by that time.
I hope so. We can kind of correspond or coordinate. That's the word. Good Lord, I'm at a loss today. Brain glitches. No, but yeah, because we have a few, but and I hope, not that I want to hold it too long, but I hope that we can coordinate that you have something, a contract in place.
Yeah.
I'm super excited about it, and I think it's important because even Dylan says in his Nobel lecture that his work is supposed to be heard, and definitely it has an impact on people. And Paul Williams says that we have this deep connection to Dylan that we want to share. And I think when we look at our personal connections and we share them, that other people understand how impactful Dylan is. And I think you're doing that. It's really important work. So
thank you.
I cannot wait till it's out there. What else are you working on? A chapter for an 80s book, maybe? Always the Dylan review?
That's right. I just got good news about this Dylan in the 80s collection.
And I knew about it when we were exchanging emails. I just didn't want to jinx anything. I knew it was, potentially
Well, now I have
happening.
a December 15 deadline?
You do.
So I'm going to need an extension. No, I'm just
kidding.
I
will give you 2 days. I'll give you 2 days. I was gonna make the joke before you did. That's hilarious.
I might need till January 3. No, I'll be working on that.
Right.
Other essays.
No, I got my Budokan review in 2 days late. That was it.
Okay.
You gave me the 15th.
That's
It got
right.
in by the 17th.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be doing Dylan review stuff. We're working on the spring-summer issue right now, which has an interview with you and Anne-Marie Mai.
Thank you for that. That came out really well. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And so that's going to pave the way for the special section in the fall-winter issue.
Where I have to work up my edits.
There you go. So you'll have a December 15 deadline. No, it's actually like October 15.
Right.
So we'll be running a special section with the papers from the Masculinity Conference in Denmark, which will be great. And otherwise, just working on essays and the memoir. I mean, the memoir is front and center,
right?
And then getting that out, and then of course, I just have all the other creative projects that are vying for my time, which I'd love to give to them.
Oh, I hope you do. I always say that there are enough people out there who have a platform who are writing garbage or saying things that should be, that no one should read. And so we need more people who write well and write it, and they have a platform that are saying things that are meaningful. And so I champion your work.
Appreciate that.
Of course.
I feel the same about all the dilettantes. You all do fantastic stuff.
Thank you. Well, we hope to. So is there anything else you'd like to talk about? To close out. Last word, Paul Haney.
Let's see, we covered masculinity.
We did.
Queerness.
Yep. Your memoir.
Memoir.
The Schertzes. I just think, vulnerability too is a big aspect. Court did a great job with that.
In
Denmark.
With those pictures of Jerry and Bob and just kind of the brotherhood that they shared, but just the need to be vulnerable on the page and with other people. And I think Bob Dylan, is he vulnerable at times? Other times, again, like we were talking about with I Contain Multitudes, he puts up that wall. He's, don't, this is as far as you can go.
Right.
But there's also boundaries there as well. And so I think that's something else that I've taken from Dylan, like just the need to put yourself out there,
right?
But also the ability we have to express ourselves as genuinely as we can, and how that will, redound to our benefit as artists.
I love that. Well, I mean, as human beings too, but as artists, where you connect to other people.
Yeah.
I told you in an email that I enjoyed spending time with you in Denmark, especially our walk around when we went to see Viking Bones, and that day where we
the skeleton.
You, Grayley, and I kind of lost the group, and you and I had a really lovely conversation. And I just, I'm so glad to be a colleague and to have developed this friendship with you, and for you to spend your afternoon with me. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I totally feel the same. Thanks, Erin. It's great to be here.
Well, that's another episode of Infinity Goes Up on Trial, and look for the next one on the 1st of the month. Thank you.